Hello there, it's Sea Falcon, and thank you for joining me as we read about the castles of the world. We're going to flip through this delightful little mini book. It's only about maybe 6 inches by 4.5, and we're going to do a little bit of architectural rambling about the different building styles that we see, and we're mostly just going to softly read about the beautiful castles across the globe. Thank you so much for joining me. Alright, let's get started. Let's make a little room first. Castles of the world. We're going to meander from the ancient times to about 700 CE, the early medieval period, the late medieval period, the early modern period, 1500 to approximately 1750, and then we're going to touch briefly on the modern era, which might not seem too modern to you, but it's 1750 to the present. Let's get started. First off, we have the Theodosian walls in Istanbul. I apologize in advance for my pronunciation of some of these. We're going to be going across a lot of cultures today, so you might hear some interesting pronunciation, but bear with me. First constructed in the 5th century CE, the Theodosian walls were not breached for 1,000 years. I love castles as means of fortification, but they're also decorative. Here at the top we have a fresco decorating the walls of the 8th century stronghold in the Amr castle in Jordan. Inside and out they were meant to terrify enemies, but also to bolster confidence and perhaps instill fear in their own people as well, the world over. Castles, fortified outposts designed to protect or dominate a territory, have been constructed at least since the Bronze Age. Unlike fortified towns, castles were not primarily intended to accommodate populations, but rather through most of history have housed a small garrison of military professionals, as well as the controlling noble's family. Castles vary widely in design, depending on the availability of building materials and technological sophistication, including structures built of rammed earth, wood, stone, brick, and steel-reinforced concrete. But in their original purpose, they express a basic truth. It was more economical to build a stronghold that could be held by a few men than it was to maintain a large body of soldiers. Castles were natural objects of prestige, since the noble who controlled a castle could dominate the surrounding countryside. Inevitably, they became such status symbols that nobles constructed castles as their family homes, even when the need for defense had long passed. And we're going to see a little bit of that transition. The transition of castles from physical and military might to more prestige, to more representations of political or economic power. And you'll see the styles and the decoration change as well, when you're not worried so much about battering rams, cannons, siege ladders. You might have a little bit more time for decorative motifs. These castles evoke an imagined age of noble warriors and aspirations for which many people still yearn today. Ancient times to 700 CE. Here we have the remains of David's citadel in Jerusalem, Israel, also known as the Citadel of Jerusalem. Repeatedly built over the centuries, the tower owes its current shape to Mamluk rebuilding in circa 1310. The Ottomans expanded it also in the 16th century. When you see it like this, and it looks desolate, it's hard to imagine it bustling with life, with floors and tapestries, with cool little sections and the heat in the courtyard. Can you imagine the smell from the fires of the kitchen? The sound of servants' and slaves' feet, perhaps, depending on the castle. Rich fabrics and music. The Arg-Ibam is the largest adobe building in the world. The citadel covers an 18-hectare or 44-acre site surrounded by a massive wall over 1.6 kilometers or 1 mile long. Gongsanseong Castle in South Korea. I love to see how the architectural styles differ greatly depending on the geographic and cultural location. Gongsanseong Castle was constructed in 475 CE when the Big J Kingdom of southwestern Korea moved its capital to Gongju. One of the many hill castles that attest to Korea's war-torn past, Gongsanseong was restored in 1993 and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. If you love castles, Korea is a wonderful place to visit, especially if you go to Seoul. There's Gyeongbokgung Castle. It's one of my favorites. It's interesting there because you can see a mixture of the old Seoul fortification walls, but also the rebuilt castle, as many were destroyed during the various wars and occupations in Korea. But even the restorations are done with such masterful craftsmanship that you can't help but be in awe of the colors and the shapes. It always reminds me of a bird's wing, the swoop. What's fascinating about roofs like these is traditionally they were made without the use of nails. So each piece had to fit perfectly in with the next. Pegs, I believe, were allowed. Somebody correct me, please, if I'm wrong, but nails and spikes were not. So it's a craftsmanship that extends beyond what you can even see on the outside. With a sheer drop to the Osum River in the north, Barrett Citadel's highly defensible location explains why a fortress had stood there for about 2,500 years. Destroyed by the Romans in 200 BCE, the citadel was rebuilt in the 6th and 13th centuries, expanding to defend an area large enough for much of the town's population to live inside. This is the citadel in Berat, Albania. Now that's quite uncommon, to have a fortification or a castle that was meant to house the surrounding populations. Mostly it was meant to house the reigning monarch or noble's family, maybe several families of high importance or wealth, or most of the people for a very short period of time, but this is a notable exception. Above, we have the Skopje Fortress in Macedonia. Commonly known as Kale, from the Turkish word for fortress, Skopje's castle was first constructed in the 6th century CE, probably at the order of the Roman Emperor Justinian. The engineers used stones from the Roman town, which had been destroyed in an earthquake. Anytime you see a stone building, I love to look for the anomalies, because quite often people were very frugal and very smart. They used rubble or stone, building materials left over from other buildings. Oftentimes, if you're looking at one building, you're really looking at remnants of another one as well. The early medieval period, 700 to 1200. Across we have the Tourbillon Castle in Switzerland. Built in the late 13th century by the powerful Prince Bishop of Sion, Tourbillon Castle for much of its history was hated and attacked as a symbol of episcopal power. Much of the castle was rebuilt after rebels devastated it early in the 15th century, and it was mostly destroyed in 1788, only to be restored again in the 20th century. Now what an approach. It's amazing that people would take the hike to destroy this symbol of church power. They must have been extremely motivated. Here in the early medieval period, we'll start to see what we have maybe in our minds, a more concrete example of castles with moats, dungeons, and things like that. Above and to the right is the Qasr Qarana in Jordan, an early example of an Islamic fortress. It was built in the early 8th century. The square building consists of 60 rooms across 2 stories around a central courtyard. Its purpose is mysterious, since it was never very defensible, did not lie on a popular trade route, and lacked a good water source. Sometimes you wonder if it's perhaps for a mystical or spiritual reason that's been lost to time, or potentially it was just a mark of power, a symbol for the people from a very wealthy individual. Who knows? Here on the left we have one in Tunisia, which was served as a base for local warlords and also protected Monastir from pirate attacks. Now, castles are not just defensible because of their construction or because of their design, but also because of their location. Here you see the, forgive my pronunciation, Hochsterwitz Castle in Austria, which the main defense is perhaps not even the castle itself, but actually the hill on which it's built. This limestone rock has been inhabited since the Bronze Age. Since the 12th century, it has been home to Austria's most impressive castle, parts of which date from the 16th century. The 14 gates protecting the steep path shows why it was never successfully assaulted. Amazing. We think always of movies when they go and they try to breach the walls, but what would happen if your forces can't even get to the walls? 14 gates, with defenses at each gate. If you made it through one, they'd just stop you at the next. And there's no motivation quite like protecting your home, especially if you have the high ground. Established in the 19th century, in the 9th century, even earlier, Rabati Castle in Georgia, in its current form, dates to the 13th century, but was substantially rebuilt by the Ottomans in the 17th and 18th. Despite its imposing constructions, Rabati Castle was successfully stormed in the Battle of Al-Khaltzik in 1828, after which the region passed from Ottoman control into Russian hands. Now, it's so interesting, military history, to see what the siege would have looked like. If you look at something like this, you'd think it would be impregnable, but apparently not. On the far right, we have Pembroke Castle in Wales. In 1093, Norman invaders built the first castle on the promontory on Pembroke, the water providing a natural defense on 3 sides. Again, we have castles that are protected from invaders by elevation, but you can also be protected by water. When William Marshall was given the site in 1189, he replaced the Motte and Bailey fortifications with the stone keep seen today. On the far right, you notice these dramatic arches. We have the citadel of Aleppo in Syria. Fortified at least since the 3rd century BCE, Citadel Hill in Aleppo is an enormous military and administrative center. In around 1200 CE, following Saladin's defeat of the Crusaders, his son expanded the castle to its current state, most notably smoothing the slope of the hill and lining it with with stones to form a glacis. Here we have a different take on the elevation. You have the natural formation of the hill, but it's been modified. It's been engineered with the stone. How could you climb something like that with arrows raining down on you? Now here is an absolutely stunning view. We have the castle of Leiria in Portugal. When Alfonso Henrique, first king of Portugal, took Leiria in 1142, he developed the castle to defend the region from Moorish reconquest. In its first decades, Leiria withstood 2 Muslim sieges, but declined in importance after the Christian conquest of Lisbon. In the 14th century, it was remodeled as a royal residence. I just imagine what the breeze would be like, coming through these delightful arched openings. It's almost delicate. It's made of stone and highly reinforced, but with these slender pillars, it feels like the wind has free access to just come in and out of this space, despite being unbelievable metric tons of weight. All these photographs are of Leeds Castle in Kent, England. Site of a stronghold since 1086, Leeds Castle was rebuilt in stone in 1119. It avoided destruction in the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651 because the owner of the time supported Parliament. Parliamentary forces used the castle as an arsenal and a prison during the conflict. Although today the castle may appear to be a Tudor stronghold from the 16th century, in fact, most of its fabric dates from the early 1800s, following the sale of extensive estates in Virginia, USA. The owners remodeled Leeds to fit their early romantic notions of what a castle should look like. And that's an interesting conversation to have. Do you owe a debt to a historical building like this to maintain it the way it would have been? Or as a piece of property, are you allowed to reimagine it to fit your own romantic ideals? Beaufort Castle in Luxembourg had its start in the early 11th century as a small square stone building protected by a moat. A keep was added in the first half of the 12th century, with further additions in the 1340s. In the 16th century, the owner stayed in touch with the times by adding a Renaissance wing. A little bit of a Frankenstein here with a bit of a building from every century, it seems. Unfortunately, Beaufort fell derelict and was abandoned at the time of the French Revolution in the 1780s and 90s. For a time, it was even used as a quarry. Fortunately, in 1893, the castle's owner decided on a program of renovation, opening the castle back to the public in 1928. One of the most recognizable castles in the world is Windsor Castle in England. It's now the longest occupied palace in Europe. The first castle at Windsor was constructed in the late 11th century after the Norman invasion. Later, following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Charles II rebuilt the castle with Baroque state apartments that still survive till today. I love how in this aerial view, the castle appears white and shining with these almost rays of paths extending into the parks and gardens from it. Still a royal residence, at the time of this writing of Queen Elizabeth II, now of King Charles, parts of Windsor are open to the public. The Queen then and the King now hold state banquets there, and the wedding of Prince Harry to Meghan Markle took place in St. George's Chapel at Windsor in 2018. Vianden Castle in Luxembourg is one of the largest fortified castles west of the River Rhine. Vianden was in good shape until 1820, when a purchaser provoked such outcry by beginning demolition that the king actually bought the site back. The castle was built on the site of the Roman castellum, or a small fort. It began as a keep with residential apartments in circa 1100, but the Count of Vianden added a new two-story palace in the early 13th century, displaying plainly the family's pretensions to power in the region. There's so many fantasy and high fantasy novels and movies that seem to take inspiration from buildings quite like this. This reminds me even a little bit of the shape of the keep, perhaps in Return of the King a little bit, just with a much steeper incline at the end. Again, we have a palace that's really being used as a family's calling card. Its desires broadcasted for even more political power. Here we have Switzerland and France. Here we have the Aigle Castle in Switzerland. I love the peaks of these roofs, mimicking the mountain tops in the distance, snow-capped. Today, it is open to tourists and is home to a vine and wine museum, thanks to its location in the midst of a major wine-producing region. This is previously headquarters of provincial governance in the 1400s. It lost its significance, of course, after the French Revolution. And now you can go have wine tastings there. I have this feeling that wine might taste better there for some reason. Now there is the epitome of a fairy tale castle. You have a long approach across the bridge, even the snow clinging to the trees. A small courtyard, you can imagine knights in shining armor, princesses in the towers leaning out, flags and standards snapping in the breeze. This is the Burg Eltz in Germany, perched above the Moselle River between Koblenz and Trier. Eltz Castle has been owned by the Eltz family ever since the 12th century. The keep dates to the 12th century, but Eltz above all owes its security to the Elsbach River, which surrounds it on three sides, and on its position on a rock spur. Eltz was more impressive before it endured a 2-year siege in the 1330s. After capitulating, the outer defenses were demolished, leaving the castle as a simpler fortified residence. Branches of the family owned the castle in common, occupying them more than 100 of the residential rooms. Here we have castles built in Liechtenstein. I'm almost positive that I've seen this in a movie somewhere. If you can recognize it from what movie or TV show it is, leave me a comment and let me know what it is. Below is the Gutenberg Castle. The natural hill at Balzers has been inhabited since Neolithic times. Unsettled conditions in the German Empire in the early 12th century led to the local count to replace the church on the site with a fortified keep. Much of the castle still dates from the 12th century, and Emperor Maximilian I renovated it in the early 16th century. Now there's a very dramatic geographic defense on the Bled Castle in Slovenia, standing on a sheer cliff nearly 300 meters or 1,000 feet above Lake Bled, so you have both altitude, sheer geographic elevation, and water defending this one. It was the chief residence of the bishops of Brixen. The main tower dates to the 12th century, with early modern elements added. Here we have a castle on the right, Spiš Castle in Slovakia. Standing in Bulgaria's Rhodope Mountains, this fortress has guarded the state's western frontier since the 11th century. The castle fell derelict after the fall of the Ottoman conquest, but local Christians continued to use the fortress's chapel as their parish church. Brilliant spiral staircase here in Hever Castle, Kent, England. It's deceptive. Outside it appears to be a medieval fortress, but inside it's a gracious home. When the Boleyn family acquired it in 1462, they added a modern house inside the existing walls, which along with the Bailey date to 1270. Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, grew up here. After serving as the family home from 1462 to 1539, Henry VIII granted it to his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, as part of the settlement following the annulment of their marriage. In 1903, the American millionaire William Waldorf Astor, of hotel fame, purchased the castle, lavishly restoring it. His family used it as a residence until 1983. I wonder, do you ever walk around a place like that and imagine that these famous icons of history once sat where you sat, or trod where you trod, or is it just home to you? No matter how storied its ancient walls, you just kick off your slippers when you come home and relax, whether or not Henry VIII's ill-fated wives were in the same rooms hundreds of years ago or not. Another castle in Shropshire, England. Some of its key features you can see here. Its wood beam ceiling and its hall has survived intact since the 13th century. There's something to be said about old growth wood, especially in England. You see these remaining examples, I think, of the Great Hall at Hampton Court Palace near Kingston upon Thames. You can still see these brilliant hardwood beams that are holding up these houses and these histories for hundreds of years. Above, we have Locket Castle in the Czech Republic, known as the Impregnable Castle of Bohemia. Its history as a stone fortress goes back to the 12th century. Ottokar II added the curtain wall and a series of towers in the later 13th century. Hussite Christian reformers tried twice to take the castle in the 15th century, but both sieges were unsuccessful. Orava in Slovakia stands on a 112-meter or 367-foot high rock spur above the Orava River. The upper castle, the citadel, is the oldest part of the complex. Now this looks like something straight out of Narnia. The Alcázar de Segovia, Castile and Leon, Spain. The Alcázar is Arabic for castle or palace, but the Segovia structure owes its shape to the Christian rulers of Castile. Alfonso VIII of Castile began converting the Almoravide stone fort in circa 1200. John II added its most distinctive feature, the new tower, and Philip II decorated the castle with tall spires in the 16th century. See these beautiful little details. It reminds you of the Disney Palace a little bit. Here we have the Malbork Castle in Poland. Notice how the colors change depending on the location, the geography, the building materials. Here is this beautiful clay red. In terms of area, Malbork is the largest castle in the world. Its strong fortifications allowed the Teutonic Order to survive, after its great defeat at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. But the order was forced to cede their mighty headquarters to Poland with the Second Treaty of Turin in 1466. This is a reference to the Teutonic Knights. There's something beautiful about light against water and stone, don't you think? That's the Örebro Castle in Sweden. It's on an island, actually, in the middle of the Svarten River. Now here we have Castle Rüschen in the Isle of Man. The keep of Castle Rüschen was probably constructed in the late 12th or early 13th century by the King of the Isles to guard the entrance to the Silverburn River. Now doesn't that sound like a phrase right out of a story? The curtain walls and towers were added in the 14th century. This is one of the best preserved medieval castles in the British Isles. Here we have the late medieval period, circa 1200 to 1500. This is the Castello Algornese in the Isle of Ischia in Italy, first fortified in 474 BCE. For millennia, this castillo defended the Bay of Naples. Here we have the Alcazar of Seville in Spain. Look at these stunning recurring geometric patterns. Both on the left, the ceiling, the decoration, but also in the architecture and the reflections. The most critical need for a castle under attack is a secure water supply. Lacking a river or groundwater source, the Alcazar's designers constructed a great rainwater cistern named the Baths of Lady Maria de Padilla in honor of King Pedro the Cruel's mistress. Now that's quite the backstory for a water source. Interesting to build a castle somewhere where there is no groundwater or river. You're completely at the mercy of the rains. The famous Alhambra in Granada, Spain. The opulent Alhambra was the chief residence of the Muslim emirs of Granada for the last century and a half before the Christian conquest of Granada in 1492. They created a great palace complex, which the new Christian monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand later renovated in the Renaissance style. Built by the order of the Emir of Granada in the mid-13th century, the Alhambra was constructed on the remains of a 9th century fort, which itself was built atop a Roman castellum. So there's multiple layers of history of fortification happening in this particular location and site. The Ananuri Castle in Georgia. Now this is the most dramatic location. On the right we have the Castle Stalker in Scotland, and on the opposite left we have the Eilindhonen Castle, also in Scotland, which is standing in a small tidal island in the Western Highlands. It was a stronghold of the Mackenzie clan, constructed in the 13th centuries. The Mackenzies supported the Jacobite Rebellion of 1719, and a naval bombardment left the castle in ruins. On the right, Castle Stalker is a 4-story keep on an islet in Loch Lake. Originally constructed in the early 14th century, it reached its present form in 1440. It is most famous in modern times for its use in the final scene of the film Monty Python and the Holy Grail from 1975. Here we have Macedonia and Bulgaria. France and Carcassonne. It has the largest intact wall of any town in Europe. Such an interesting geographic location, but these beautiful circular shapes, these geometric shape, not square, not rectangular, but round, in the Castillo de Belver in Spain. It's on the Mediterranean island of Majorca, built in the 14th century. It is one of the few circular castles in Europe. It's very well preserved, thanks to the fact that it was used as a prison from the 18th century into the middle of the 20th century. I suppose being grateful for that is an interesting emotion. Left is the Bodiam Castle in England. The East Sussex home was built out of fear of French raids, but the old-fashioned walls suggest greater interest in show than in defense. The Bran Castle in Romania is known as Dracula's Castle. It was first constructed as a wooden fortress in 1212 to guard Bran Gorge. Yes, I can definitely see a Dracula story emerging from this dramatic landscape, can't you? Estonia and Belgium. Here we have a moat, which is compensating for its rather flat terrain. Here we have Ukraine. And on the next page, Bosnia and again the Czech Republic. Above, in the Czech Republic, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV had this castle erected between 1348 and 1365. For decades, its treasury housed the imperial regalia. There's quite an interesting backstory to this one, as many of its defenders died during the Hussite siege of 1422, after attackers catapulted both corpses and manure over the walls, and the defenders of such a beautiful castle succumbed to disease. It's important to remember the stories and not just the beauty of the buildings that we're seeing. Now this one, Oberhofen Castle in Switzerland, looks more like a summer house. The Crusaders constructed Sea Castle inside in Lebanon on an island off the Mediterranean coast in 1228. The cannonballs are still embedded in the seawall as shown above, and they attest to the strength of the fortress's construction. Well, it definitely wasn't for lack of trying. Here we have the citadel of Quaid Bay in Egypt. This stunning blue-green water against this beige and brown stone. It was badly damaged during the British bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, but has since been restored. Tibet and Greece. Here we have the palace of the Grand Master of the Knights in Rhodes, Greece. Also known as the Castello, the Grand Master's palace was the citadel and administrative center of the Knights Hospitaller after they occupied the island of Rhodes in 1309. The Knights developed an existing Byzantine fortress, creating a rare masterpiece of Gothic architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean. Another Spanish castle in Segovia, Spain, Coca Castle, built by the Archbishop of Seville in 1448. The Christian architect imported many elements of Islamic art, fusing the style into an overall late Gothic design. Primarily used as a residence, Coca Castle now houses a school. Forget Hogwarts. I want to receive an invitation to study here. Belgium, Netherlands. This one now houses museums, I believe. Odescalchi Castle in Italy remains a magnificent example of Renaissance military architecture. We think of castles as a singular building, but it can often be a complex. We have Belarus in Serbia. This one strategically located on the south bank of the Danube. At various times, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Turks, Serbs, and Austrians have all claimed this castle. Here we have Donegal Castle in Ireland, and below Oxburgh Hall in Norfolk, England. Donegal Castle was built as a stronghold for the O'Donnell clan. When the O'Donnell leaders fled Ireland in 1611, the castle was granted to an Englishman, who added a comfortable Jacobean wing. The castle was restored relatively recently in the 1990s. Below, Oxburgh Hall was built around 1482 by Sir Edmund Bedingfield. It's still owned by his descendants, although it's now administered by the National Trust. It's a moated country house rather than a castle. It looks imposing, but would not have been able to hold out against a determined assault. Lithuania. A wooden footbridge now connects the castle to the mainland. But during its time as a Lithuanian royal center, the fortress would only have been accessible by boat. Moldova. Again, you have these incredible timber framing. The Citadella, the island of Goza in Malta. Austria. These beautiful, pristine white buildings just rising out of this landscape. Here we have the Royal Fort in Lahore, Pakistan. The large 20-hectare site was almost completely rebuilt in the 17th century by Akbar's successor, including Shah Jahan, who also commissioned the Taj Mahal. Here we have Wales. I do believe Wales is a country that has the most intact castles in the world. Caernarfon Castle in Wales was an important part of King Edward I's plan to establish permanent control over Wales with a series of strong castles. Because of its enormous expense, however, the interior was never completed. Its strategic location on the coast of northern Wales made it a logical place for Edward I to construct a castle, but it fell into disrepair in the 16th century when English-Welsh tensions were lowered. Nonetheless, it remained strong enough to withstand 3 parliamentary sieges in the 1640s. That was most definitely built to last. We have Turkey on the right and Albania on the top. Again, these beautiful curved structures. Again, East Sussex in England. When Henry VI, treasurer, wanted a residence to reflect his social importance in 1441, he rebuilt the family's manor house on a grand scale, one of the oldest brick buildings in England. Herstmonceux Castle has some decorative elements of a castle, such as crenellations and towers, but it is a palace rather than a fortress. Definitely not a place you want to be sleepwalking. Kilchurn Castle in Scotland, now a picturesque ruin. Most of it was constructed in the mid-15th century as a base for a cadet branch of the Campbell clan in the Central Highlands. When the Campbells of Glenorchy became Earls of Breadalbane, they abandoned Kilchurn, which was a ruin, by 1770. At the time, the castle could only be reached by a causeway at low tide. Everything seems romantic until you want to leave and you can't, because you're waiting for the moon and the water. The fortifications of Kotor in Montenegro. There have been fortifications at this site since the Byzantine era. Here we have these sumptuous shapes and this delicious clay red color at the Red Fort in Delhi, India, as part of the early modern period, circa 1500 to 1750. The Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan began construction of the Red Fort in 1638 after he decided to move his capital from Agra to Delhi. Constructed of local red sandstone, the palace complex is enclosed by a 2.4 kilometer or 1.5 mile long wall and covers an area of more than 100 hectares or 250 acres. The Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur, Rajasthan, India. This is the Osaka Castle in Japan. What a brilliant view of the ancient and the modern Japanese culture in one photo. These brilliant, symmetrical, non-decorative, modern and contemporary business buildings, and in front we have this beautiful building that was begun in the 1500s, I believe. Unfortunately, it was soon burned during the wars to unite Japan. The Tokugawa clan seized the shogunate and began construction of a new castle in 1620, creating an edifice that was highly defensible, but also a monument to the family's prestige and power. A castle that was both symbolic, decorative, and a place of defense. On the right, we have Matsumoto Castle in Japan. It still has its original stone and woodwork, and is regarded as a national treasure. Here we have another example of elevation, as well as natural defense such as water. There's this beautiful slenderness to these Japanese castles with its tiers, wide and low at the base, and extending to these delicate towers on top. The Marmaris Castle in Turkey. What we see today is the work of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who erected this edifice in 1522 to support his attack against the island of Rhodes. Egeskov Castle in Funen, Denmark, the best preserved Renaissance water castle in Europe. It was built on oak piles sunk into the center of a small lake. The enormous number of trees needed gave the castle its name, which means oak forest. It reminds me of Venice, an entire city built on sunken forests. Here we have the Chateau de Chambord in France. You can notice there's towers, there's even a partial moat, but it says here that these elements are anachronistic and probably intended for decoration and not for defense. Here we have the Red Fort in Delhi, India, which was the chief residence of India's Mughal emperors. However, much of the marble work was destroyed by British troops in 1857. But you can still see its mixture of Persian, European, and Indian architectural and decorative elements. The Nakal Fort in Oman, the Vasil Gebi in Ethiopia, the Kyrenia Castle in Cyprus, the Fort Metal Cross in Ghana, the Cape Coast Castle, also in Ghana, is one of the infamous slave castles of the Gold Coast. The Swedish African Company first constructed Cape Coast Castle in 1650, but it changed hands many times, most of its owners seeking profit from the transatlantic slave trade. It's not all fairy tales and romance, unfortunately, in these walls. There's a lot of painful human history. Poland, Venezuela, Colombia, The Colombian one is very interesting as they have subterranean tunnels to aid between the different bastions. It was expanded in 1657 to protect the port of Cartagena by land and by sea. Here we have the Drumlanrig Castle in Scotland, which includes 120 rooms and is made of local pink sandstone in late Renaissance architecture. We have Croatia, Sweden. Again, these beautiful colors. Attacked during the Swedish conquest of the province of Sania in the 1650s, bullet holes can still be seen in its walls. Belarus was renovated into the Baroque style. During the Soviet period, it was used as a sanatorium. What an excellent courtyard. Here again we have Chandok Palace in South Korea from the Joseon dynasty, originally labeled as the Prospering Virtue Palace from 1392. The palace's extensive gardens create a harmonious atmosphere. The lovely detail work of Changdok Palace attests to its role as the principal residence of the rulers of Korea for over 270 years. There's a lovely symmetry between the buildings on these pillars, the water, and then this natural island and curving tree. Again, we think of a palace more in Western sensibilities as a single towered building, whereas here in Changdok Palace, it's a series of buildings and its interconnected green spaces that make up the palace. Morocco, Malta. This is actually a Carthusian monastery until it was destroyed by the Protestant king in 1526. Inverary Castle in Scotland and Belvoir Castle in England. The Castillo de San Pedro de la Roca in Cuba is a fortress near the city of Santiago de Cuba with a series of fortified terraces. It was partially destroyed by English privateers in 1662, but when it was successfully completed, the Castillo successfully beat off several English and French attacks in the Caribbean. Now there is a classic fairy tale castle in Slovakia. It's now a 19th century romantic fairy tale castle thanks to the rebuilding masterminded by its owner, Count Janos Ferenc Palffy, between 1888 and 1910. Deeply impressed by the French chateau of the Loire Valley, Palffy invested a fortune in recreating this French style in Slovakia. Finally, we have the modern era, 1750 to present, although I feel like not many castles are currently being built in the present. Here we have an interesting phrase. Visually stunning, the Boutron Castle was very inconvenient to live in and soon fell out of use. For running through the hallways in long gowns and clandestine meetings by candlelight, I think you can't beat a castle, but I imagine living in it day in and day out can be quite inconvenient. Moats are all great for repelling thwarted lovers, but maybe not so great for leaving to go to the grocery store. I imagine it can be quite damp and drafty as well. Here we have Hwasong Fortress in Suwon, South Korea. It was built to honor the remains of King Jongjo's father. The whole complex took 700,000 man-hours to build. So many people that we don't have any record of them, but their hands must have done so much work to to leave behind these monuments for us to see and to treasure. Le Mirage in Namibia, the Bithna Fortress in the UAE, the Al Jahili Fortress in the United Arab Emirates. It's a mud brick fortress. Here we have Peckforton Castle in England in the Gothic Revival style. I do believe it's a hotel currently, and that would be a fantastic place to see. Again, with the materials, it seems to shine in the sun, this castle in the Czech Republic. Here we have the Dunrobin Castle in Scotland, which is definitely high on my bucket list. The second Duke of Sutherland commissioned architect Sir Charles Barry to rebuild Dunrobin Castle in the fashionable Gothic style between 1835 and 1850. With 189 rooms, this is the largest stately home in the Northern Highlands. Much of its interior, unfortunately, had to be rebuilt after a fire in 1915. Now this one on the right, in Hungary, is very interesting because it was originally built in wood and cardboard in a Budapest city park for the Millennial Exhibition in 1896. It was so popular that it was rebuilt later in stone in 1904 to 1908 in both Romanesque, Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque styles. Now, the Peña Palace in Portugal is on the site of what used to be a monastery. The colors are absolutely stunning. They say it's an eclectic but surprisingly harmonious building. A neo-Gothic structure, but also including Islamic architectural and decorative elements. Following the Republican Revolution of 1910, Peña Palace became national property. What a stunning view all the way to the ocean. These lovely, graceful, oblong curves and these beautiful circles. Now this is a romantic entrance in Hohenzollern Castle in Germany. This was constructed in 1846 by order of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia. It is mostly in the Gothic Revival style, but you can see elements of the French chateau architecture that adds this sense that we would think of sort of fairy tale romanticism. It was never regularly occupied, but it's still owned by the original family. And the Prussian flag flies above it when members of the family are in residence. Now, this is one of the most famous castles, and apparently one of the major inspirations for the Disney castle. It holds over 1.3 million tourists each year. The Neuschwanstein Castle in Germany. The style is eclectic, including Romanesque, Gothic, and Byzantine elements. I do believe it is still owned by one of the original families as well. The Liechtenstein Castle in Germany. Montenegro. You can see how the architecture of this building mirrors the architecture of the island. It was used as a prison for sailors, a concentration camp. It is currently being planned to, I'm not sure if it's ever gone ahead, but it's currently being planned to turn into a luxury hotel, though I'm not sure who would want to stay at it. Morocco. It's crumbling, the mud brick Casbah. What a monumental building. We have the castle in Russia, the Bori Castle in Hungary. It was built By Daniel Bory, this modern castle was almost completely the work of one man. For nearly 40 summers, when he did not have academic duties, he constructed his castle with only 1 or 2 assistants and decorated it with his own structures and sculptures. De Haar Castle in Utrecht, Netherlands. It's fascinating to look at these buildings in detail, like the intricacy of the stonework, or even of the shingling, the window panes. Sometimes their glass is so old you can still see the bubbles in them. But also to just take a macro view and look at the symmetry and the geometry of the placement of the water, of the parks, of the citadels and towers. A monument to the wealth of the Rothschild family. It was unfortunately mostly torn down in the late 15th century, rebuilt in the 16th, and there's a 1900 reconstruction as well. We'll finish off with the Hatley Castle in Victoria, Canada, not a place you normally think of castles. In 1906, Lieutenant Governor James Dunsmuir of British Columbia and his wife commissioned this 40-room mansion. It is largely constructed of concrete and was designed in the Tudor Revival style popular in the Edwardian era. A massive Edwardian garden enhances the castle's effect. Hatley Castle was sold after its original owners died, and in 1940 the Canadian government purchased it and used it as a training establishment for the Navy. Hatley now houses the Royal Roads University. I would wear a gown to class every single day. And there we have Castles of the World. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been delightful to have you along on this ride as we look at the beautiful architecture of these castles of the world. It's always a great day when you combine a little bit of architecture, history, and some romantic daydreaming. Hopefully you were able to imagine yourself running through these halls, perhaps in a gown or with a sword, preferably with both. But it's been delightful having you along for this read-along. I hope it was very relaxing for you. And have a lovely day. Thanks so much for joining me. Bye-bye now.